welcome everyone to Macro Social Work Stories. My name is Steve Burkhardt. I'm here with my partner, Dr. Gary Jones. And I'm thrilled to be able to introduce a very special guest for us, Dr. Eva Moya, who's an associate professor at the University of Texas in El Paso. We often talk about in social work about lived experience and how important it is to be able to validate and understand lived experience. Well, one of the important things about Dr. Moya is her lived experiences as somebody who's lived on both sides of the border, down in both in Texas and in Mexico, her entire life. A woman with a commitment to work on the border with the people there, attempting to cross over to live their lives that they seek and deserve, and in the research, as well as in the last few years, with a level of intensity that it would be wonderful to hear about in this broadcast. So, Eva, if you could begin. I mean, as you said, you've lived this your entire life. You've been doing this work at the border for 41 years. You've been in academia for 11. What's a couple of messages in your story? Tell us a little bit about your story as to why you think this work has always been important, but also perhaps why this work is even more important today that you and the people you work with are doing.
Thank you so much, first of all, Dr. Burkhardt and Dr. Jones, for the invitation. It is an honor. And, you know, what's so fascinating is that, you know, Dr. Burkhardt, I use your books in classroom. So I've been following your work. You know, I have brought you into the macro experience here in El Paso. And so to have this conversation now with the author of books and readings, you know, and discussions, I think it's really cool, as the students would say, but most importantly, it really helps us to connect also the stories that you write with the experiences that we have. And I remember being in a classroom once and telling my macro students, I said, you know, one of these days, I'm going to reach out to the author and we're going to have a conversation about the U.S.-Mexico border. And I'm going to suggest that maybe somewhere in his next book, we have a chapter that discusses borders and international social work perspectives. And so here we are. So I'm going to take this that we're doing back to the classroom. And I know the students are going to go like, wow, that's really cool. Going back to the story, you know, I didn't know that I wanted to be a social worker. So it took a little bit of, I would say a couple of years to find out that the social work was the calling. And finally, when I was able to connect with that purpose and that mission, for me, it was clear at the beginning that it really had to do with understanding systems and understanding macrostructures. However, you know, I trained at a time where the curricula really didn't have that option. And so I was sort of like stuck in administration, which is an element of macro practice, but that was the only option that I had. And so I graduated from UT Austin with a wonderful, you know, degree in Master's in Social Work. Never visited the campus. So I was actually studying in El Paso while living in Juarez, Mexico, while commuting back and forth daily, twice, and doing practicums actually in both countries at the same time. So it was really a fascinating journey. So I learned about social work in that fashion. So for me, really looking at borders and not only the geography of borders, but borders means any kind of line that is traced by history, whether it is borders within the states in the United States or borders within the municipalities on the Mexican side or the international borders between the two countries. For me, is how do we look at border communities as a way to bridge, as a way to connect, as a way to leverage resources, talents, and opportunities. So that's how my brain has been wired, I think, the last 40 plus years, really trying to find ways of not dividing, which is really what we hear in the public discourse. You know, the borders that divide and demarcate, the borders that tells you on which side you're in. So my upbringing is, okay, let's look at the bridges or the connections that can bring people together so that, you know, it doesn't matter if you're a social worker on that side of the border or on the other side. As long as you're working with humanity, you need to be trained on how to access, how to navigate, how to refer, how to make the most of the communities in where you are a part of. So that's been sort of like the upbringing and the training. And so now I have the luxury that, you know, I'm in teaching, and so I'm in a research scholarly profession. And
Mhm.
so I can pull that and bring it into the classroom as much as I can. Given that I cannot take my students to the Mexican side, not officially, unless, you know, I have the blessing from legal counsel and the Office of International Programs, which is very
Really?
difficult to do nowadays. You know, I
Yeah.
can bring the border experience. I can bring my partners from Mexico into classroom settings so that my students can be enriched by the
Mm.
experience of living in this part of the world.
Wow. So you said so many things that unfortunately we only have an hour, but that's a joke. Um, you said so much. Was there ever a time where building the bridge was possible as opposed to the wall? The wall has been. What does it take to build the bridge, in
Ah,
your experience?
yes, you know, I grew up at a time where you could literally cross the international bridge between Juarez and El Paso by sort of like going to the front of the line and in a verbal statement indicating if you were American. And so that in itself is sort of like
Okay.
off because we're all Americans in one way or another.
Yeah, yeah.
But the authorities would take your word, you know, as such.
Wow.
And so therefore you could cross the international bridge and come to study, come to work, come to visit loved ones, you know, interact. Those times have changed. I trained at a time where we had organizations in this community that were truly binational. You know, I trained in social work back in the late 70s, where I could do an internship on the Mexican side. As long as I could find a supervisor, good luck, Eva, finding a supervisor that was licensed, that was residing on the
Oh,
Mexican side. But, you know, I was able to get it done. So, yes, there was a time where we could do things differently and do them much more internationally and binationally. There was a time where we could take our students to do internships in Juarez, you know, in nonprofit organizations. There was a time where I could take my students to do visits to the shelters. Now I can take my students, but they have to go as citizens of the world, not in a university capacity per se. Given the dynamics, given some of the spikes of violence, you know, which is not specific to Mexico because violence is
of course.
universal. But given the restrictions on travel, that has imposed some limitations. But I think we used to have close to 80 organizations along the US Mexico border that were doing things together in one way or the other. We have lost traction. We no longer
Yeah.
really have a US Mexico Border Health Association. The US Mexico Border Health Commission is really unilateral. So now they're looking
Wow.
at things from the US side, and my partners from Mexico are looking at things from the Mexican side.
Wow.
And it's unfortunate because now more than ever, the kind of challenges that we have in social work require us to be international, require us to have global understandings. And I see governments pulling away in some areas of basic human rights. So it's up to social workers and other health professionals and caring individuals and humanitarian efforts to continue to build those bridges. And by the way, the bridges that are referred to are relationships,
Yeah.
not the
Of course.
physical ones, because
Of course.
we have those. We have those, and they're populated by thousands of vehicles and pedestrians that cross daily, one way or the other. But I'm talking about relationships that are really solid and partnerships in place.
I never knew the the richness of 80 organizations, what that meant in terms of those bridges being built. And as you said, binational, that it just happened again and again and again. The popular press only talks about the wall, but obviously there's so much more that
Mhm.
goes into either a wall or a bridge. The building of relationships. Is there any, and given the intensity of what's at the border now, the humanitarian crisis that's there, um, there's so much more to be done that social workers, A, we need to understand around the country because I would say we don't, and B, what it is that's going on that we need to really support and address. Because I think, as you said, the whole world is only going to be, the problems are only going to be resolved internationally. They're not going to be
Mhm.
resolved on anything, within one set of borders. Um, what do you think when you look at the crisis today? From the outside, it just I can't imagine from the inside it looks better. It just looks so. It truly is a humanitarian crisis of enormous horror. How do you and the people with whom you work, the people with whom you care and support, what are you doing now that's moving rebuilding the bridge, if at all possible, or is it something that's just more difficult now than ever?
You know, this is a fascinating part, that despite the fact that we don't have the presence of the 80 plus organizations, what we do is that we have incredible and powerful humanitarian efforts that are not waiting for the governments to act or to fund or to do. So I've seen in my community in Juarez and El Paso and along the US-Mexico border, I think the greatest humanitarian organization effort, basically funded by international organizations. You know, it's fascinating. When I train in social work, you know, Mexico was sort of like this, almost like down the developing world category. And through the last 40 years, Mexico has progressed significantly in terms of democracy and in terms of economics. So it was fascinating that the international organizations were no longer looking at Mexico as a place that really needed development and sustainability. So not with the humanitarian crisis, but also with the violent crisis that has taken place, primarily the presence of organization of crime and the different manifestations of crime and violence. What you now see is, for example, the UN, the Organization of International Migrations. You have the presence of UNICEF, you have the presence of Save the Children, you have the presence of HIAS. Never before, when I trained as a social worker, had I seen the presence of my colleagues and counterparts now in the trenches, almost having a permanent presence. And this is Ciudad Juarez. I can only imagine what's happening on the other 40 municipalities on the Mexican side, because Juarez and El Paso, it's a pair of sister cities, but so is Tijuana with National City, so is San Juan Nogales, so is Del Rio with Ciudad Acuña, you know, Edinburgh, and so forth. And so what I see is presence. I see greater international awareness. I see philanthropy coming through. I see organizations of regular citizens of the world coming together to reach out and say, how can we ensure that our communities become like sanctuary communities? I know sanctuary is not a popular word in the world of Texas and many other states that have like the allergy to welcoming the other, you know? So I see the great, in my opinion, and I've been around for some years, you know, maybe I'm not putting my glasses, but I see incredible humanity in the making. And so for me, that really makes me proud to be a borderlander, because I look around, and when I look around, I see people that care for the other, whoever that other is. I'll give you a quick example. You know, I was putting a list together of partners yesterday for the university of organizations that do a lot for our students, that usually do so in a very quiet fashion. Out of that list of 20 agencies, 10 of them are not in El Paso. Actually, they're either in Juarez or they're in New Mexico, you know, and they are the ones that are helping move donations. Give you an example. Yesterday, it was moving water. It was creating a list of things that are needed on the Mexican side in shelters that are right now attending to the needs of literally hundreds of people that are seeking asylum or seeking refugee status, that come from the interior of Mexico, that are traveling from Colombia, Venezuela, Cuba, Brazil, Ecuador, Panama, Belize, Guatemala, Honduras. And, you know, it's my partners in New Mexico, in Placitas, New Mexico, you know, 30 minutes away from Albuquerque, that are saying, Eva, what are the needs? And so what do we social workers we do? We connect people. I see myself really as a connector. I tell my students that we're like glue, like gomita. Gomita is the word in Spanish. And it's like, we're like glue. And we sort of like, we're not necessarily the Velcro type, but we sort of like help facilitate and leverage. And so we spend a lot of time, I would say, outside of the teaching and the research, connecting people with possibilities. So yesterday, when I went to the shelter yesterday afternoon to Ciudad Juarez to take one of my colleagues who's a photographer, retired attorney, he's in his mid 80s. He drives monthly to Juarez, to serve, to photograph the realities, to write the narratives, to go back and share the stories so that others can humanize what the situation is. He helps to reframe the discussion so that it's not about the other, but it's about our brothers and sisters in need. And he helps to leverage support. So yesterday's story was about Casa Respetrans, which is a shelter in Juarez, but it was also about another small shelter that does work primarily with members of the transgender community. But it was also about writing up about the hot dog drive that is taking place in Juarez this weekend to raise funds for a hospice facility that is run primarily with people that have mental distress because the government is incapable of doing, the things that need to be done. And so what social workers do, we connect, so if I could be the driver for Morgan, my friend, or I could be a cultural interpreter, or I could do the inventory to see that, my God, we need water. We need baby formula. The big need is diapers, and I was telling the manager of the facility, there's just so many boxes of diapers that we can get before we ran out of funds. And so the conversation turned to, do you think you can make your own diapers? Do you think I can get cloth? We already have the sewing machines. Do you think you can make the diapers for the children in the shelter, but maybe give some of those diapers to the other shelter in the community? So those are things we can do, without a doubt.
I see, sorry to hop in here, but
yes.
I see a theme from actually stretching to last week too, with waiting on the government to do the right thing. There's tends to be a group that waits, hoping that we can lobby and gather forces to get the incremental change that results eventually in the thing that we need. And then there's the other group who crosses the border, says these are the things we need, gather it, or this is the minimum we take, and then we show, we show, don't tell, while telling, let the others keep telling. But I hope that social work starts doing more, that bridge you're talking about, Dr. Moya, and just not necessarily does every person need to be lobbying or being at the border, but making sure both are getting done, even if you're not doing it. And you made me flash back to Harvey as well when I was doing Red Cross work. And one of the first groups to show up, outside organizations to show up, which was really an inside organization, was Mexico's Red Cross. So they were the first over there. They were the most helpful. They were the easiest to work with. And they showed up as humanitarians helping their Americans across the border. And I found no end of small jokes inside of how kind the entire group was. And they stayed, and they stayed, and they stayed longer than the other orgs too. So just to make sure that the basics were met. And I'd forgotten about that until you were talking. But they were definitely a group that just showed up. So if we're allowed in, if the humanitarian organizations are allowed in, they do so much good. And I don't think it should be left up to only the nonprofits to do it.
Correct.
Government should be coming in and going, oh, right, let us fund this. You're doing a great job, without trying to alter it. Pay the minimums needed for living wages and whatnot. But we know there's a long way to go there. So I really appreciate this perspective. I think these all tie together really well. And we don't necessarily have to wait for government to give you the okay to do it the right way. And I really appreciate your work. So.
Yes.
Thank you.
The glue, I love the glue. I love the idea of social workers as glue. It's there's so much in that could be developed. I just think it's really wonderful. It may end up in a chapter. Who knows?
Why not?
Hey, but it's a wonderful way to imagine who we are and what we do. Because without waiting, we still make the demand, but we also don't wait. Gary, I don't want to be the only one. I'm sure you.
Yeah, so a lot of insight has been discussed on today. How one of our primary roles as social workers or helping professionals is connecting those relationships. You talked about bridges. Bridges are relationships, and trying to partner with our students, because many times we only see one type of uh, picture of our brothers and sisters at the border. They only show one side of it. Um, how can other professors give a more balanced perspective on what's really going on in other countries, where we're not looking as we got it going on in America when we really don't?
Yeah, really.
You
That's
know,
funny, but true.
that's a fascinating observation. I think that we can do a lot of things from where we are to actually have a better and greater understanding of border perspectives. And again, it doesn't have to be the geographical border on the US-Mexico border, but I value much when others take our stories, and stories, I say plural because there are multiple stories, and they're able to project the stories, and they can bring some of these stories into the classroom. So one thing that I would say, you know, now with the online virtual sort of like mechanics of how we're interacting, there's nothing that would preclude us, you know, in El Paso from being part of your spaces and in your classroom setting and saying, okay, I want to invite you to come over. I want you to share with our students. And it doesn't have to be the professor, it could be other students that are really providing perspectives. How do they feel? How do the military students that are based out of El Paso feel in a community that it is primarily or 85% Hispanic, Mexican origin, highly mobile, highly international, given that we're right at the midpoint of immigration, migration. We've been at the epicenter of experiments that have been made, wrong policy, bad policy. We're also rich in military presence. And we're at the midpoint of the US-Mexico border. How cool and how dynamic is that to bring that story into the classrooms, let's say in Iowa, you know, in Hawaii, you know, in Washington State, in Oregon, in other parts of California. So I would say we need to start by educating ourselves. So I start by educating myself daily and constantly and saying, wow, I do not know it all. On the contrary, every day I feel like I'm less about the policies, about, you know, the procedures, about the dynamics. And so therefore, I make concerted effort to always sort of like be asking. The second is framing the conversation, I think is really important, because we could also be the reproducers. And I think Dr. Burker speaks of this beautifully in his work about how we can reproduce the oppression from which we're trying to break ourselves from. And so we end up only creating, you know, more inequalities without really the intent. And sometimes in social work, we may be doing that because we tend to forget where we come from, or we have lost that groove or that passion and that essence and that focus. So I think watching ourselves really listen to the language that we use, which really needs to be a language that is inclusive, that it is caring, that is diverse, that is appreciative of the different ways of being. Really ensuring that we don't judge, because that also happens, that we judge who the other is and who has the right and who doesn't. And so I think we need to catch ourselves in the profession also saying, well, what is it that I heard you say? Well, what is that you mean? So you are for equity and inclusion, and yet, you know, your agency or your program is excluding some members of the society. I just don't get it. Third, I think that we need to reach out more. I think that we're in an incredible time in social work profession to really be a little bit even more eclectic, more proactive, to do greater and more effective advocacy, and do that in a multilingual, multicultural way. And we really need, I think, to be much more intercultural in our approach. You know, yes, you know, I have books that talk about multiculturality, you know, in social work, but I think we need to go beyond really multiculturally. And then we also need to organize. So imagine how powerful, and I know that Dr. Burkhardt is doing this with a group of very committed practitioners and academicians. How do we organize around fair pay, equal access? You know, how can we organize to really have a movement where we end up protecting the basic human rights? You know, we had this discussion in class, as a matter of fact, in the macro class this week. And I asked my students to be critical of the Declaration of Human Rights. And so a good number of my students said, Professor, you're the first one that asked us to look at the Human Rights Declaration. And we had no idea that these were the articles and it's outdated. And so it has to be fixed. And I said, okay, so what would you do? If you had the opportunity to reach out to the UN, what would you tell the UN that is missing? Well, there's a whole laundry list of things that are missing, given the times and given the dates and given the challenges. So we need to figure out a way to organize more strategically and intentionally across geographies. So imagine if we were to partner up with my peers in Maryland, you know, because I need their help. They could probably benefit for understanding what is it like to be brought up, you know, in a primarily Hispanic, Latino, you know, international setting. How rich would that be? And then the last thing, I think our curricula in social work, undergraduate, graduate, needs to possibly be revamped a little and sort of like infused. Infused, yes, or a lot. Infused, you know. I hear my students say, Professor, you know, you're the only one that sort of like teaches the macro thing. It's like, what do you mean the macro thing? Well, the macro class, and we're taking it in the last semester, and we're about to graduate. And sometimes we missed the opportunities to really bridge, going back to the bridge analogy, bridge one professional, multiple venues, different arenas, more importantly, populations, and do that as one profession per se. So those are some general observations.
We certainly have some themes here, don't we?
Yeah, they're brilliant.
One thing you made me think of too when talking about the UN, which is some of my background. And by the way, your students can get involved this week because it's General Assembly Week, and there are at least two very large organizations within the UN that are taking all the youth feedback. So if you want to catch me offline, I can connect you.
Thank you.
Or on Twitter, no problem. And yes, you're right. It does need a lot of revamping. And they worked on that when we were in Utah before the shutdown, 2019, end of the year. So I can send you some of that as well. It's a step forward, but of course, it's a lot of countries and a lot of different policies and religious beliefs, and it's very difficult to get agreement. But they started on it. The thing I was going to say as well is working with the UN, the thing I realized a couple of years in is how much the US sees themselves as the insiders and never the outsiders. And the last few years, the UN has come in and shamed the US, you know, with statements, whether it's in the South or in Flint with water crisis, that we have a problem with how we treat our humans here. And there have been several, I can't even think of them off the top of my head. And so I think even looking at it in a more critical perspective, especially for those in areas of the US that are not as flexible in their political thinking, they may want to start just with the citizens in the US as a way to see that we aren't even meeting criteria with those who reside within our own borders, which may help with the empathy for those on the edge of our borders or on the other side first, that there are certain, you know, floors and ceilings to human rights that we need to address for everyone. And we do that here too. We aren't better than. And I think even just addressing that ethnocentrism, haven't thought of that word or used that word probably since undergrad, but we're learning that. It's not all about us and then us giving to everybody else because we are the great heroes of the world. And a lot of families and family systems are still perpetuating that myth that harms us when we are trying to help in international settings. Thank you so much for all of your work. This has been a very good one.
I'm interested, you said about 9 things that are really interesting, but one I wanted to go back to is you said we got to move past the kind of multicultural way or cultural competency, the way we do it, and do the intercultural. And I'd like you to talk about that because I think it's a really, really, you know, I also love your language because that you called yourself a borderlander. I just thought, what a wonderful term. But which of course speaks to the intercultural part. So I wonder if you could talk more about that because there's so much energy put into all these variations of how we look at culture, diversity, and so on. And I think you're onto something that we'd really benefit hearing more about.
You know, the phenomena of being a borderlander, I really credit my colleague, Dr. Oscar Martinez, and the great work of the author and advocate Gloria Ansaldúa, who really speaks about borders as having this incredible dimension that open up hearts and that have a way of generating emotions and creating its own set of culture and interactions, where you can try to explain what is it like to be a member of either one side or the other, and you really can't, because you're really infused in multiple cultures, and at the end of the day, you're the product of these 2 or 3 countries, and you cut yourself together right at the middle. And so that in itself provides you with an incredible optic for life. So it's neither or. The beauty is that you're able to move between the 2 countries, multiple languages, and when others try to define you, you don't really fit in boxes. So you're not really only a Mexicano or Norteamericano. It's like, no, you're a fronterizo or a fronteriza. So when I use the term borderlander in introductions, people look at me kind of awkward. And sometimes they, once they said, is that an awkward last name? And it's like, oh no, Lady Go, that's like a phenomena. It's like, what do you mean a phenomena? It's sort of like you using a pronoun. It's like, okay, no, this is almost like an identity. It's part of who we are. So read the work of Dr. Oscar Martinez. He's just incredible in writing about border people and the different elements of being a borderlander. And so, so you were saying that, and then intercultural. Yes, I trained early on through the lens of the Kellogg Fellowship. Colleagues such as my colleague Darlene Bailey, Dr. Bailey, and others. When we're exposed to international understanding, it sort of like opens the brain. I think of it as a parachute. And once the brain is open and expanded, the beauty is that like you can't go back to the original shape. It's sort of like when the late Professor Paulo Freire says, okay, start naming the world. And when you start naming the world, it looks different. And you begin to take ownership and you begin to have this sense of concientización that really helps you to own and understand and begin to name the things that are not acceptable. So I think of the journey of being intercultural as really having a very deep understanding and respect for all the cultures. And I think that that's a tall order for social work, like many other disciplines in the world. But I think that for social work, it's especially important. Because what does having a deep understanding mean? And then when I say all the cultures, well, what does that mean? It also means, embracing cultures that are not only affiliated with ethnic or racial, identities, but the cultures of how we interact with each other. That means that as social workers, we're going to need to be very comfortable. We're going to need to become very comfortable working with marginalized communities that traditionally, I don't see many social workers going to work with. I don't know about you, but I see, and I have a lot of respect for all my peers. I see social workers that want to come into a program, want to train, want to graduate, want to go into a private practice, want to work out with the government, want to be in a little bit more comfortable setting where people come to them. And so let the others come so that I can help. And I'm sitting there saying, well, it doesn't work that way unless people are like mandated to go to you, or there's a great level of awareness and intention to want to seek for help. But then the other reality is that the most marginalized and some of the most forgotten members of society are the ones that don't come to us. So where are we? So as social workers, I think we have the responsibility to reach out to where the marginalized, the oppressed communities are. And so unless we put that in curricula, unless we create the internships, unless we really create the simulations, unless we take the macro approach and really embed in our curricula experiential opportunities for our students to be creating assignments that are really meaningful. I'll just give you a couple of examples. So like moving through the lens of macro is not easy because, our curriculums are traditionally geared to address our competencies, which are fantastic, but students feel a little bit more comfortable looking through the micro lens. We're lucky sometimes they move through meso and very few move to macro. So what I did in my macro course, I sort of like disrupted the traditional model. And I said, I want my students to learn about macro where in community. So I took the request of taking my students off campus in a beautiful Bhutanese architecture campus, looking to Mexico. That's where my campus is. It looks to Mexico. It looks to the wall. It looks to everything. And yes, we can't really touch it, but I can look through my window. And I said, I want to take my students off of the comfort of the campus and take them to the Opportunity Center for the Home Free, which is the largest shelter we have, not funded by the government, led by a social worker who experienced homelessness. And I said, I want to bring my students into the neighborhood. Well, they created a crisis. Why? Because why am I taking the students off campus to a poor neighborhood that already has incredible stigmas? What about parking? So where are the students going to park? My God, what if something happens to their vehicles? My God, does that mean that they're going to have to walk the sidewalk? And
as though they're 8 years old.
And so I went all the way through to my president. I brought my president into the campus. I asked my president to walk the neighborhood. I asked my dean. I asked my chair. I did whatever it had to do to ensure, that there was safety first. And that second, this is how I could really do macro work. And so for now, 5 years, with the exception of COVID, the classroom space has been at the facility. But every semester, I laugh about it now, because I have students that really are intimidated. Actually, I have students that have gone to the office of the dean to complain and said, my God, this professor is putting us at harm. This professor wants us to be assaulted. And I paused and I said, no, this professor wants you to train and be a grounded individual, where at the end of the day, what makes you think that you're not going to be working with the home free? Because all you have to do is look around your peers to know that home free conditions prevail you. That includes your peers, and that is your neighbors, and that is the clients or the individuals that you would potentially see. So I do a couple of assignments in the class, and with this I will close. I said, I want something meaningful so that at the end of the day, my students are not producing work for the professor, because you know what we do? We sort of like, look, we grade, we post, and then you file, and then it's gone. And I said, enough of that. I'm too old for that. I said, what if we were to do community intervention projects that are grounded in the population? In this case, the home free. You name it. Children, youth, adult, elderly, veterans, military, documented, undocumented, you name it. It cuts across every single segment of society. So your intervention projects, you will have a community mentor that brings lived experience, come into the classroom. You would work in small groups, and whatever you produce is a product that you give back to the mentor and to the organization. So that's how the students are working now. With COVID, we're doing the class online in real time. I have a student that is moved to Germany. I have another student that is going to Hawaii. And my students are working with the Opportunity Center. They're working with Shantia White, who is a social worker, the founding and manager director of White Social Work, Inc. So I have her and her students working with my graduate student, high school students, graduate students working on teaching notes, case scenarios. I have my colleagues from Philosophic Systems Institute looking at reentry. I have my colleague, Luis Susana Correas, who is right now in the asylum process, who's a transgender advocate, who right now I think is in New Jersey, but originally based in El Paso, mentoring my students in the macro class. And then the last mentor is my colleague from Lutheran Family Services Rocky Mountain Refugee and Asylum Program, who is based out of New Mexico. Wow. So in a classroom setting, those experiences are created so that the students can produce and can really interact across cultures. So we move from the multicultural to a deeper understanding, a focus of mutual exchange of ideas, understanding the cultural norms, developing real relationships with their peers and their mentors, and where ideally, hopefully, no one is left out, because everyone is engaged and everyone's lenses count. And at the end, we try to grow together and produce together. Make sense?
It's remarkable. in your spare time, Eva, which you have none, obviously, it would be great for you to write that up for the Journal of Social Work Education, because it's a brilliant, it's got so many levels of pedagogy and integration on so many different
It
levels.
also needs to go, I think, and I was thinking in a very practical term, how much of this has gotten cut out of social work programs just for the reasons you were discussing, for liability issues, and the faculty individually are being cut out of doing anything flexible outside of the committee made week to week process. So there's very few, I think, professors or tenured professors for that matter, able to just adapt their curriculum of the week. They get in trouble for doing anything outside of. It's become very McDonald's. And I think that's an issue where I think it was an overcorrection on making sure students hit all of these points and all the competencies before graduating, to now there's no flexibility in the expertise of the faculty you hire. And so all the faculty are teaching the same thing with the case vignettes all matching. The students can, all talk to each other outside about how they do on the certain tests, because there's no flexibility in the thinking for the professors or outside quote unquote field trips. And any sort of adaptation is, a 3-year process to get it approved. I know even, for example, the thing we all did probably in our programs, and in the micro level too, I think it wasn't just macro, mindfulness, walking around on the grass. We had class outside, and we talked about mindfulness with clients, even on one-on-one, and feeling the grass on your feet. And it's something that was done all the way through the program, and I went back and taught at the same institution. It started becoming a problem just a few years ago. Not going anywhere, actually walking outside because they might step on something, or it just went on and on to where it became such a pain. The professors stopped doing it, and it served a couple of purposes. And it was just one of those ad hoc things that have been done over the years and are now no longer allowed, or it needs special permission. And so I would love to see us get more of this back. And I feel like when I was an MSW student, the faculty did have more flexibility in doing these things with us, and we get their background and expertise in a way I don't think they do now, because everybody's even using the same PowerPoints at a lot of the programs. So how do we rebuild it back in with CSWE perhaps mandating that there is a key component to faculty's expertise? Like, we actually want the people we hire to share, because just listening to you is reminding me of this. You have a host of, I would hate for you to be teaching human behavior in the social environment and following the curriculum when you have all of that at your disposal. It would be a completely different course if you're allowed to teach it from your perspective, from your background, from your way of expertise. And it makes me feel frustrated inside to see the slide that's happened. And I would love to, like Steve said, have you write that up, but also have that be a key component for CSWE to look at, that we need this back in our schools. Whoever we hire, we're hiring for a reason. Anyone can stand up and, teach to the test, just regurgitate the same PowerPoints. We don't need expertise for that. So getting back to the expertise of those who are teaching our students, I think would really make that connection and the bridge.
Gary, did you want to say something?
So utilizing frameworks that push out the desire to just remain in the classroom reminds me of Dr. Barbara Solomon. And I didn't have the experience of going outside the classroom, but my professors, undergrad, talked about their experience and how partnering, not being a savior, but partnering with clients will bring about change. And so I'm hopeful that the use of technology, as well as connecting with professors who not just trying to complete a course, but trying to have impact on the emerging social workers so they can bring about desired change in the lives of individuals. I'm thankful for the wisdom that you bring to the classroom and the community. So thank you.
You're welcome, Lear.
And you clearly care about it. That's what draws people in. I think that makes a connection too. Even if their desire to help doesn't match yours, just the idea you can see that this person is following the thing that they care about and those they care about helping. You know, this is how she thinks out of the box. This is how it happens, rather than discussing something that somebody else is predetermined.
Eva, we'd like you to have
reminder.
we'd like you to have the last word. One of the things that a couple of things came up about the power of your humility is really quite remarkable, and that humility lives in what I'm sure you know this quotation from Lisa Watson, the Aboriginal leader, who said, "If you come here to help me, please leave.
Exactly.
But if your liberation is bound up in mine, let's get to work."
Exactly.
And so you get the last word.
Wow. No, I enjoy this conversation and the space without a doubt. I am enriched, and I would certainly now invite you to be part of the space where we meet with our students and we enrich our perspectives. And now more than ever, I think that we need to find connections and relationships that really help us and solidify us as a vocation and as a profession. I am worried that we might be sort of like losing the groove or sort of like moving in a very different direction. You know, some of us are working closer with our peers in the macro arena to have an encyclopedia. As a matter of fact, as I'm speaking, my partners, the editors, are finalizing the first macro encyclopedia of social work entries, which is incredible. And so we need to make sure that we do more of that, that we also encourage our peers to write about their stories. And like when you said, Steve, we know what if a chapter, what if a piece, what if a case? So the more that we can diversify those writings that we have access to, the richer I think that our experiences are going to be. And then I would like certainly for our graduates to continue to mentor others, especially the new ones that are coming into the profession, to ensure that we remain ourselves grounded in values and in practice, and that we grow in community, because at the end of the day, it's really going to take a large community to change the paradigm of how do we look at humanity and service. Our work is cut out for us. I tell this my peers, you know, this is the best time to train in social work. You name it, we got it. You know, and really become really global in our approach. And it's fantastic if we could travel elsewhere. That is certainly, you know, a joy. But given the restrictions, then our mind has to travel. And regardless of us being able to get on a plane, we need to travel in our learning and in our experiences. So I am grateful for the opportunity to share. And anything I can do from this end, I'll be happy to.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you for your time today. We thank you for watching Macro Social Work Stories. We'll see you next time.
Eva, that was amazing.
Oh, no, thank you.
Good work.
Thank you.